So I'm going to talk a bit about online reading. We'll look at the research into online reading. And then we will look at the implications that has for the classroom and the sorts of things we can do with our learners in the classroom. I will talk for about half an hour and leave time for questions at the end, okay? So there is a lot of research on reading, but obviously the research into online reading is more recent, just because online reading, it wasn't a thing until the end of the 20th century. And some of the things that were predicted have come to pass, are true, and some of the things that were predicted have not actually happened. So this is something from Clifford Stoll writing in Newsweek in 1995. And Newsweek is a sort of reputable magazine. And Clifford Stoll predicted this. He said, "The truth is, no online database will replace your daily newspaper. No computer network will change the way government works." And that's not that long ago. That's what, 25 years ago, 26 years ago. And I think we can say those predictions were not right. Okay, clearly newspapers have changed, certainly in the UK, beyond recognition. And I think every government in the world has changed how it works because of computer networks. The reason Clifford Stoll thought that the internet wouldn't really catch on, can you believe it? He, predicting the internet wouldn't really catch on, was this. This was his experience of trying to do online reading. He said, "I hunt for the date of the Battle of Trafalgar." Now, so that's a big thing in English history. Hundreds of files show up and it takes 15 minutes to unravel them. One's the biography written by an 8th grader. The second is a computer game that doesn't even work. You can sort of feel the man's pain here, I think, that, he's really not happy. A game that doesn't even work. And the third is an image of a London monument. None of them answer my question. Now, of course, it's quite possible for us just to dismiss that and laugh at it and say, well, that's because Clifford Stoll can't have been a very good online reader. If he'd put in a better search, he'd have got the answer to his question and so on. But actually, those issues he experienced are the things we have to deal with still today. You put in a search and you get hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of results. We still have to search them. We still have to go through them and sort the relevant from the irrelevant, the high quality from the low quality. So those things that he was saying, stopped online reading working for him are still the issues that we have to deal with today, and indeed our learners have to deal with today. Another prediction about the internet was that it would be the death of reading. It would kill reading, partly because we would just find more interesting things to do, would be one thing, but also that we'd be able to get information through other mediums, other modes. But actually, the internet didn't kill reading. In fact, Mangan says very clearly, we can say that we are reading as never before, and that the internet has brought about an explosion of reading, We're reading more than ever. And the reason for that is partly that we are reading different types of text. We're not just reading the traditional text, a newspaper article, a magazine article, a novel, a textbook. We're not just reading those, but we're reading different types of text as well. So I've put here, online readers are also often working with new text types, which blend features of written and spoken language to a large degree. So I'm thinking of that, in spoken language, there's a lot of body language. We make gesture. You can tell if someone's joking with you by the fact that they're smiling when they say it and those sorts of things. And we're now creating written texts that try to mimic that in some way. If you think about how we put emojis into instant messages that we send each other and things like that, it's a way of sort of blending features of written and spoken language. And of course, we can also create new text through multimedia texts and inserting video and visual elements as well. At this point, I just want to highlight one thing in particular, that it's easy to make sort of binary distinction between saying, well, we have print on the one side and online on another, but we need to remember that there are a whole range of text types within that, just as we have a whole range of print text types, from books to magazines to different genres. Online, we get different text types as well. So we could have a very sort of simple PDF sort of document. And if you compare that to an online hyperlink text, clearly the experience is a bit different. You can have a traditional word-based text against, as I say, a sort of more multimedia text with video and all sorts of things in it. So we get different text types. And also our reading experience will be affected by the device on which we're actually trying to read. So our experience of reading will be different if it's on a laptop than if we're trying to read something on a relatively small screen of a phone, for example. So the actual device we're using will affect our reading experience as well. Okay, so what are some of the sort of principal differences? Well, this is from Marianne Wolf, writing in 2011, the principal differences between reading online and print. And she says, the characteristics of a medium like the internet invite the reader to move from one stimulus to the next in rapid fashion. The characteristics of a medium like the book invite more focused attention. So I guess what we're looking at here is when she said, move on from one stimulus to the next in rapid fashion, she's probably thinking about the distraction and the way we just move from glancing through one text to glancing through another, but not reading deeply and carefully. And this is picked up as well by Nicholas Carr, who makes a very, very similar point. And he says, when we go online, we enter an environment that promotes cursory reading, hurried, distracted thinking, and superficial learning. But Nicholas Carr does allow for the possibility that it's not all online reading is like that, because he says it is possible to think deeply while surfing the net, just as it's possible to think shallowly while reading a book. But it's not the type of thinking that technology encourages and rewards. So these are quite typical views, I think, that people have of the internet and reading online, that it's about speed and it's about distraction. But we will look and see to what extent that is borne out by the research in just a moment. I want to just sort of highlight some of the similarities and differences between print reading and online reading. So the first thing to say is good readers do well in both. So if you're a teacher, you look at your classes, the learners who do well in print reading will also do well if you were to test them from reading from a screen and online reading. So the skills are not completely different. We must make that point. They overlap to a huge degree, and we'll look at that in a moment. But I think we would agree there's more distraction online. Just this morning, I was reading a newspaper article on my mobile phone, and my thumb must have slipped on something because suddenly an advert took over the screen and it was shouting at me about something or other. So it's designed to distract me. And quite often with online reading, there is more distraction, clearly. I think most of us would agree with that. I think there's a need to be ever more critical and questioning online. Now, that's not to say that critical reading is a new skill. It certainly isn't. We've always needed to be critical when we read. But if you think about a traditional print source, so you look at something like Cambridge University Press, for example, well, if you get a book from Cambridge University Press, that will have gone through an enormous peer review process, editing process. I should say other publishers are available, of course, not just Cambridge University Press, but it's gone through a huge sort of checking process. But now anyone can more or less print anything, publish anything online very quickly, but it may not have gone through that quality assurance sort of review. One thing I really want to stress is that all paper-based reading skills are needed online. So I'm not for 1 second, not 1 second suggesting that what we should do is throw out, what we would normally teach our learners, traditional elements of reading teaching, and replace them. We need those traditional elements as well. And so let's just remind ourselves of what those things are. First of all, there is a very good case for saying that if you want to help learners read, whether you want to help them read online or from print, teach vocabulary. In the end, readers need to know the words on the page. There's not much substitute for that. We need to keep doing the basic things of seeing a word and automatically, instantly decoding it. When I'm reading in my first language, in English, I will be decoding and linking to lexical knowledge between 4 and 5 words per second. 4 or 5 words per second, giving a reading speed of around 250 to 300 words per minute for general comprehension. And that automatic decoding will lead to reading fluency, and reading fluency links to comprehension. We know that as people can read more fluently, so their ability to comprehend text also increases. So these are basic reading skills that are needed whether you're reading from print or online sources. You still need background knowledge of text type organization. And as I say, there are new text types as well that people need to become familiar with. We still need to be able to apply reading strategies. So these things are common and are essential to reading, whether it's print or online. But we need additional reading skills online as well. We can't just have those traditional ones because there are new things we have to do. Let me give you an example. We need to search. And if you think back to what Clifford stole, that first thing I showed you at the beginning of the talk from Newsweek, one of the problems, he didn't obviously write a very good search. If he couldn't find out the date of one thing in history, probably the problem was with the search. So we need to be able to help people write better searches that will rely on background knowledge to some extent. People need to be able to evaluate the results of a search. So when you get lots and lots of results, how do you know the good from the bad, the reliable from the unreliable? When you've got hyperlinked texts, we need to be able to evaluate the usefulness of the links we're seeing. And we should remember that this isn't a choice we're going to get. As we go through the 21st century, our learners are going to need to be able to read online. Okay, there's not much different. There's no doubt about that, I don't think. So a question for you really. Do we understand more when we read online, or do we understand more when we read from paper? So you may like to just think about that. Hopefully you've got some ideas for those questions. Let's look at the research evidence. This is research, quite recent research by Virginia Clinton, 2019. Clinton did a meta-analysis of 33 studies. So she looked at 33 other studies and drew conclusions from the patterns within those studies. And first of all, she found no difference in speed. So she didn't find that people were reading quicker or slower online. She found no difference in comprehension when reading fiction text. However, she found an advantage for paper when reading informational text. So this is quite important for us as language teachers, I think, because most of our learners are probably going to be using English for study, which will mean informational text, or work, which will be informational text. So she found an advantage for paper when reading informational text. And she found an increase in metacognition from paper. Now, metacognition means how we monitor our own learning, how we monitor our own understanding. So what she found was that people were less good at knowing if they were understanding something when they were reading online. There was an advantage to paper. So the key takeaway from Clinton's study was readers may be more efficient and aware of their performance when reading from paper as compared to screens. Some other research, this is from Pablo Delgado and his team, and Delgado and his team reviewed 54 studies. And again, he found improved comprehension when reading from paper. The benefit was greater when there was a time constraint. So if you told people you've got 10 minutes to read this text, the advantage from reading it from paper as opposed to a screen went up. And there was an overconfidence of readers when reading online, an overconfidence. So this goes back to that metacognition thing that Clinton was talking about. what Delgado found was that online readers thought they were understanding the text, but actually not always understanding the text. Allocation of study time was more erratic online, but the benefit was only recorded for informational texts, not narrative ones. So this absolutely agrees with what Clinton found. The problem seems to be when we're trying to read informational texts online. There may be various reasons for that. It may be that informational texts tend to be more densely packed, for example. One thing that is hard to explain is that there was an advantage of paper-based reading is greater when in more recent studies. So you might think as people do more and more online reading, so they'd get better and better at doing it. But actually, the advantage for paper appears to be increasing. Now, that is so difficult to explain that I think all we can really say is more research is probably needed if we want to get to the bottom of that particular question, because it's hard to think of why that might be. So what do we need in the classroom? Well, first thing we need, I believe, a balanced reading program, which still deals with reading basics. Learning words, decoding words, absolutely fundamental to reading, whether it's online or print, that's fundamental. But we need exposure to and practice of reading online in an L2, because that will be the future for our learners. I think without any question, that will be the future. We need to use appropriate texts. That means appropriate in terms of level. We need to make sure that we also include informational texts and exposure to new text types, because people need to become familiar with those genres, because familiarity with genre improves comprehension. We definitely need to help our learners with strategies to monitor their comprehension. This is true of all reading. It doesn't matter whether it's print or online, but it seems to be more important with online reading, because the research from Delgado and Clinton suggested that that was the problem. We're not monitoring comprehension as well online. We need to help our learners to be critical, because not everything online can be trusted. And we need to give practice in developing new reading skills, in particular navigating what Cho and Afflerbach call a non-linear textual environment. So what that means is if you give somebody a book, they're likely to read it from page 1 to the end, or they'll use the index or the contents page to identify the section they need. But once they've found the section they need, they'll start at the beginning and read to the end of the section, probably. Whereas when we land on a website, the information may be dotted across several pages, and there's no linear path. We actually have to create that path. So we need to maybe help our learners in doing that. So that's what I think we need. And now what I'd like to do in the last 8 to 10 minutes of the talk is just show you a few activities that I've used with my classes, and you may be able to, if you're a teacher, to use them with your classes, or you may be able to adapt them for your classes. So that's how we'll spend the last few minutes of me talking, okay? First thing I do with my students, just very simple, complete these sentences, and this is just a way of getting us to be able to talk about the differences between print and online reading, just the sorts of things I've been talking to you about this morning. This is a way into prompting that discussion. Very simple, easy activity to do with your students. Obviously, I would, if possible, you do it in English if you're teaching English, but it could be done in L1 as well if it would help. Monitoring. Now, I've put these 3 pictures here. Why is let's look at the one on the right, the one of the football and the goal. Well, why is it there? Well, it's there partly because I like football, I suppose, but it's there to remind us that we have a goal. When we read, we're typically reading for a purpose. We want to find something out. And when we read online, when there's so much distraction, so many links to other things, we need to keep asking ourselves as we read, is this helping me answer my question? Is this serving my purpose? Does this meet my goal? So that we don't get distracted and go off and just read more and more texts that are less and less relevant to the problem we're trying to solve. We need to help our learners do that. The picture of the clock, well, that's about time management, time distribution. How much time do you have? Are you getting through the text in apportioning time in roughly even ways? And the picture on the left, well, that's meant to be something that depicts understanding. And we need to keep asking ourselves, and we need to train our learners. We need to train our learners to ask themselves, do I understand? Do I understand? That's the key question. If they don't understand, they need to go back and read again. This means that we can train our learners to do this after every couple of paragraphs, after every section. Stop. Could you summarize this? Do you know what's going on? Are you building that summary in your head? These are things that we can train our learners to do, and we need to do that. We need to train them. This is an activity I quite like doing with my students. My students I did this with are about B1, B2 level. So you prepare a digital text that can be edited, so a Google Doc or something like that, but make it as plain as possible, all the same font size, no graphics, etc. Then learners work in small groups to design the text for online publication. So they use images, they use headings, they can link to glosses, they can insert video. Why are they doing this? Well, first of all, if you can pick the right images and you can pick the right headings, then you must be able to understand the text. So it's a way of sort of checking comprehension, if you like, in some ways. The words learners put glosses to, definitions to, help us as teachers see where they're getting problems, what they think are difficult, what our learners think are difficult. But it also familiarizes us, our learners, with a new text type. Hopefully that helps them to understand the conventions of a more multimedia-based text. For critical reading, some very basic things we can just train our learners to do. You know, if they're reading something, we'll do an online search for the author. Who is the author? What can you find out? Have they written other texts? Do they appear to be an expert? Who's the publisher of the text? Are they a reputable publisher? We can train our learners to do things like use a colored pen or highlighting tool to show the facts in a text and separate those from opinions. So we use a different color for opinion so that we can start analyzing what is fact, what is opinion, because quite often they get conflated, they get brought together in a persuasive way, but actually one that we should be critical of and thoughtful about when we see that. So train our learners to use the internet to find out whether texts are reliable. Another thing I do with my learners is rate the links. So we select a text that's got a number of hyperlinks in it. The learners read through it. We do a standard comprehension check of the sorts of things that probably happened in every classroom. And they do that without opening any of the links. So the first time through, don't look at the links, but just got to get an understanding of the text. Then we go back through it and the learners open the links and they start rating the links. They start saying which ones were useful, and they answer the question, well, what added information did I get from that link? Did it serve my goal? Did it serve my purpose in reading? Remember, we always want to bring the learners back so that they don't get distracted. Is this serving my purpose? Is this serving my goal? Really important. One of the things we need to remember is that not all sources, when you search for something, not all sources are equally good, equally reliable. So we set the learners a speaking or writing task. For example, discuss the pros and cons of space travel. I have no idea why I thought of pros and cons of space travel, to be honest. Anyway, there's some sort of task, a discussion that they have to prepare for. And the teacher supplies the learners with 5 or 6 links to a variety of sources. Now, the learners don't have to read all of those links immediately, not all the way through, but they need to start evaluating them. So they need to have a quick glance at them. They need to look at the source of them and to say which ones they think are most likely to be useful. Which one would they read first? Which one sort of would give them a good understanding of the subject? Are there any that are not useful and they could discard completely? So we give them some links as teachers, and the learners start trying to say which links they think are most useful to the task they've been set and why. So this is a new reading skill, this sort of rating the links idea. Of course, once the learners are used to doing that with the teacher supplying the links, they can do searches and find the links for themselves in English and try to evaluate those themselves. Okay, this is something that I do with my learners quite a lot. It's based on a sort of web quest idea. So imagine you want to study business communication at a university in the UK or other speaking environment. Of course, you can change the task to anything you think is relevant to your learners. You find a potential course, okay, and then you answer these sorts of questions. Now, the purpose of these questions are that we won't get a linear text. The learners will have to start navigating the website, looking for where information is hidden, this non-linear view of text where we have to create, as readers, we have to create our own path. We can't just be given a path by the writer. So those are the sorts of questions I would ask. But as I say, the task can change. You can set the task to whatever you think would be appropriate for your learners. Okay, there are some things to read. One of my interests is extensive reading. So there are a couple of things on extensive reading there. We haven't talked about extensive reading today, but these things are free. So why not? They're available freely on the CUP website. There's also a book that has a chapter on online reading, but I'm sorry, that is not free. That one isn't free. That costs money. Those are the references that I've spoken about. Thank you very, very much for listening. 5-10 minutes, I think, for questions, if there's anything you would like to ask. Yes, synonyms for keywords to widen vocabulary. Yeah, anything that helps vocabulary learning is great for reading. There's no question. Are these readers reading in the native language? The research studies are interesting. Somebody's asked, are the readers reading in a native language? That may have been referring to the Delgado and Clinton bits of research. That was done on all sorts of online reading. So it was largely L1 reading, but actually the most research evidence, whatever is true of L1 reading, generally is true of L2 reading too. So if you look at something like the research into reading fluency, what holds true for L1 is also true for L2. So it's very, very, very likely that it would be similar. I like reading paper copies. Yeah. When I ask my students, would you prefer reading online or print? You'd be surprised. So many of them prefer print, paper copies, hard copies of things. Copy. I'm kinesthetic. Okay, thank you. That's nice. Thank you for all your kind comments. That's very nice. Yeah, I have two problems. My learners' reading paths are understandably different based on their previous experience, and I tend to lose them in class. Yeah, obviously, when we've got sort of mixed levels of learners, it can be difficult. I quite often try to break texts up. If I've got that sort of issue, I try to break text up so that the weaker learners are always being given a summary. So we don't just go from the beginning to the end of the text, but break it into smaller bits so that we can give a sort of oral summary so that the weaker learners are getting that sort of understanding of the beginning of the text. How can we motivate our students to read loudly in online sessions? Well, first of all, we need to say, well, do we need them to read loudly? I mean, a lot of reading some reading could be done silently. The key thing for me is, can we get our learners to read outside of lessons? Actually, in extensive reading, there's no substitute for reading. If you want to be good at reading, whether it's in an L1 or an L2, first language or second language, you have to read. And we need to motivate our learners to read outside the classroom if we can. For reading loudly, one of the things I would say is try to use texts that are written to be read aloud. So if you've got young learners, a lot of kids' stories are written to be read aloud because caregivers, parents read to their kids. But any sort of a play or something like that, something that's meant to be performed, something which is dramatic in some way, and let learners maybe prepare it, let them read it through silently for a few seconds first, so that they're not just worried about decoding the next word, but they can actually think about how it should sound and want to make it sound, because they've got a bit more confidence having read first silently. So I would precede reading aloud by reading silently to answer that question. What do you think of asking the students to translate the text? Is it a good idea? Yes, it's a pretty good strategy actually to translate the text. It's obviously quite time consuming, but it's good. Sorry, I'm reading other comments as well. Thank you for the nice comments. Any strategies that skimming and scanning activities that emerge in newly published research? Well, yeah, there are lots of strategies, and I think if I were going to teach my students one single strategy, the takeaway strategy I always try to teach every single class I've got is, do I understand? Really keep monitoring your own comprehension. Keep asking yourself, do I understand this? So many of my learners, I give them a text, they start at the beginning, they get to the end, and then I say, well, can you summarize that? No, I don't know what it was about. Why did you keep going then? Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you go back? Why didn't you look words up online? Why didn't you do something different? We've got to persuade learners that, they can't just pass their eyes over the text. They've actually got to do something and monitor whether they're understanding it. Yeah, the second problem is when students read online, they tend to scan documents for main ideas. Yeah, that can be a problem. We can maybe help them by setting tasks that demand a bit more than that.